Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. It's been a while since we've done a History Network podcast, but we are back. There was a small hiatus while I had a new baby, which is marvellous. So if you would like to become a sponsor of the podcast, if you would like to sign up via Patreon and become a patron of the podcast, patreon.com/the History Network, that would be marvellous because I've now got 6 mouths to feed. Anyway, without further ado, the History Network.org podcast, season 33, episode 1, Charles Upham VC. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast as well. Charles Hazlitt Upham VC and Bar. Just before his 31st birthday in September 1939, Charles Upham volunteered as a private in the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force, the 2NZEF. He had been in the Territorials but refused to join at any higher rank. He was soon singled out for his natural leadership qualities and made temporary Lance Corporal, but refused to attend the Officer Cadet Training Unit, since he feared that such training would delay his departure for Europe. He determined to learn everything he could and excelled in the use of the bayonet, machine gun and hand grenade. He once complained at the futility of having to lay a lawn at camp headquarters, which made him miss bayonet practice. By the end of his training, his clear leadership abilities had been recognised and he had been made sergeant. Upham sailed with the 1st New Zealand troops for Egypt in December 1939. In July 1940, Upham was finally persuaded to attend officer training, despite his known lack of respect for army conventions and rank, as well as a blunt and outspoken nature. There he was insubordinate, questioned everything, and was immensely unpopular with his British training officers. He was critical of the tactics taught, especially against tanks and aircraft. Placed last in his course in November 1941, he was nonetheless commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant and given command of a platoon in the 20th Battalion, made up of rugged and tough farm men like himself, from the Canterbury region in the South Island of New Zealand and the west coast of the South Island. With his platoon, he served with the New Zealand Division in Greece in March 1941 before being evacuated to Crete. The 20th Battalion, along with the 28th Maori Battalion, were stationed at Malem Airfield in preparation for the German invasion of Crete. The New Zealanders, under the command of Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, had roughly a month to prepare their defences, but few resources other than manpower. Malem, the keystone to the German airborne invasion, fell on May 21st. A counter-attack was organised quickly, and at 4 a.m. Upham led a platoon of C Company to the village of Pyrgos near the aerodrome and reported back that the Germans were in ditches behind hedges, in the top and bottom stories of village buildings, fields and gardens. Unfortunately, the battalion counter-attack was not pressed home, and attention was instead shifted to taking the high ground overlooking the airfield. Upham, despite being ill with dysentery, led his platoon forward the 3,000 yards to the edge of the airfield, fighting all the way unsupported and against a defence strongly organised in depth. The platoon reached men from B Company and extracted them. During this operation, his platoon destroyed numerous enemy posts, but on 3 occasions sections were temporarily held up. On the first occasion, Upham himself went forward and, under heavy fire from a machine gun nest, he advanced to close quarters with pistol and grenades. When a second section was held up by 2 machine guns positioned in a house, Upham went and placed a grenade through the window, destroying the crew of 1 machine gun and several others. On the third occasion a section of his was held up, he crawled within 15 yards of a machine gun post and killed the gunners with a grenade. Then, despite being described as a walking skeleton himself because of dysentery, he carried a wounded man out of the rallied troops to collect other wounded men. With a corporal, Upham then went forward 600 yards through enemy territory to bring in the company, which had become isolated. He killed 2 enemy during his action and brought the company to the battalion's new position. In all this time, Upham refused to go to the hospital, determined to stay on duty. On May 23rd, Upham held an exposed position overlooking the airfield until the battalion withdrew towards Canea at dawn. Upham was wounded at the Platanias Bridge, but after he had his wound dressed, insisted that he return to battle. On May 25th, the 20th Battalion was part of the counterattack at Galatas to allow time for more units to withdraw to Canea. Upham was heavily involved in this action, being wounded again, this time in the leg. Still, he led his men, killing 40 enemy with rifle and grenade fire. When ordered to retire, he left his platoon under command of a sergeant and personally went to inform other troops to fall back. Watched by his men, he was fired on by 2 Germans, played dead, and then crawled into a position, and having the use of only 1 arm, he rested his rifle in the fork of a tree, and as the Germans came forward, he killed them both. The second to fall actually hit the muzzle of the rifle as he fell. The decision was taken to retreat to Sphakia on the south coast of Crete, a 40-mile trek over the mountainous terrain. Despite his illness and injuries, Upham made the trek and then on May 30th, with his platoon, climbed a steep hill to place his men in defence of the retreat. A unit of 50 Germans was spotted advancing, and, climbing to the top of the hill with a Bren gunner and 2 men, the 4 succeeded to take out 22 of the enemy. Upham, exhausted, ill and severely wounded, was evacuated to Egypt that night. He had not eaten for the entire 9 days of the retreat, save for condensed milk, which his men found for him. Upham and his platoon were an essential part of the counter-attack launched on May 22nd and the delaying action to allow evacuation until May 30th. Upham was considered the typical New Zealand soldier, rugged, resourceful and resilient. One of his hallmarks was his complete modesty. He was genuinely distressed at being singled out for his bravery when he thought that there were so many others more deserving recognition than him. As the quotes from his Victoria Cross citations show, Upham was awarded that highest honour for a series of heroic actions spanning over 9 days. Upham recovered and recuperated in Egypt, learning of his award in October 1941. His commander, Lieutenant Colonel Howard Kippenberger, spoke of his distress at being singled out for recognition, but also that every man in the battalion agreed that he was thoroughly deserving. Every man in the company and every man in the battalion is satisfied that the award was made to the right man. He was unquestionably the finest fighting soldier that it had throughout the operation. Upham was convinced to accept the award in recognition for all the brave actions of the men around him. Interviewed for New Zealand radio, Upham took no credit for his own actions, but spoke of everyone but himself. He thanked his commanders as well as the NCOs and men throughout his platoon, battalion and division, stating, "It is very easy to do any job under those circumstances." He even went so far as to name all the men in his company who had been left in Greece and Crete as prisoners or casualties, asking the New Zealand public to send them care packages. Other than his bravery, it was Upham's care for his men's well-being which seems to have most endeared them to him. A contemporary described him as an officer and a gentleman, determination and singleness of purpose personified, loyal, constructive, quiet, unassuming, and friendly. After evacuation from Crete, the New Zealand Division served on garrison duty in northern Syria until summoned to the Western Desert on June 14th, 1942. Upham had rejoined the division by this time, having suffered jaundice and pneumonia in the meantime. The division was assigned to Minkar Kaim. On June 24th, the German 21st Panzer Division and the 90th Light Division broke through the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade and surrounded the New Zealanders. Lieutenant General Freyberg had been wounded, and command fell to Brigadier Lindsay Inglis, who decided that they had to break out as soon as possible. The breakout was set for June 28th, and, led by the 4th Brigade, the New Zealanders drove through the lines of the 21st Panzer Division. During this action, Upham, now captain, commanded C Company and mounted grenade attacks on gun positions, tanks and transports. Upham led, as always, from the front, and his attacks were carried out at such close quarters that his hands and face were lacerated by the shrapnel of his own grenades. He also ran out, exposing himself to fire so that the Germans would give their positions away and be taken down by the men of C Company. After the breakout, the Germans were disorganised and could not arrive at El Alamein for some days. There the New Zealand 4th and 5th Brigades were placed to attack Ruwaisat Ridge, some 200 feet high, 14 miles south of El Alamein. The attack on July 14th did not go to plan, the New Zealanders coming into contact with the enemy much earlier than expected and well short of the ridge itself. The commander of the 4th Brigade needed a clear picture of what was going on and asked 20th Battalion to send someone forward. The commander of 20th Battalion detailed that task to Captain Upham's C Company. Rather than assigning anyone else, Upham went forward in a jeep himself and soon came under fire. He crisscrossed the battlefield and reported back to the commander of the brigade that the main German positions were on the flat in front of the ridge rather than the ridge itself. There was no choice but to press the attack. Upham's company was then ordered to distract a force of German infantry, armoured cars and tanks which had taken up position in a depression. The citation for his Victoria Cross bar stated that Upham, without hesitation, at once led his company in a determined attack on the two nearest strong points on the left of the sector. His voice could be heard above the din of the battle, cheering his men. Upham had his elbow shattered by an enemy bullet, but continued to lead the frontal attack which swept everything before it. The ridge was taken, but the New Zealand forces were exposed to artillery and machine gun fire and were without tank support. Upham had just made his way back to C Company when a mortar shell exploded and killed most of the survivors and left Upham badly wounded in the leg. The German counter-attack, led by heavy tanks, overwhelmed the New Zealanders, who had only a few anti-tank guns. Upham was found near the 6 surviving members of his company, and all were marched into captivity. A bedridden Upham was a terrible and dangerous prisoner to his Italian captors. When he had recovered, Upham attempted escape from his POW camp, which led to him being sent to Germany in September 1943. He attempted to escape again and was therefore interred at Colditz Castle, the place for habitual escapers, in October 1944. Almost as soon as he was captured in Egypt, Kippenberger had begun to gather the evidence to support a bar to Upham's VC. It was considered so unlikely that a bar would be awarded that the question was put off until his release at the end of the war. 5 acts of conspicuous bravery were attributed to Upham in the Egyptian desert and would have been enough to earn 2 Victoria Crosses in their own right. On the subject of the bar, King George VI asked then Major General Kippenberger, "Does he deserve it?" Kippenberger's reply, "In my respectful opinion, sir, Upham won the VC several times over." Upham was released from Colditz on April the 15th, 1945, and awarded his Victoria Cross on May the 11th by King George VI. Upham himself was unaware that there was a movement led by the commander of the New Zealand Division, General Bernard Freyberg, to award him a bar. When the evidence was gathered, however, it was clear he deserved it, including his commander Kippenberger's comment to King George in person. By the time the bar was granted, Upham was back in Christchurch, New Zealand. His response when it was announced was typical. "Hundreds of others have done more than I did." Upham maintained that he had only done his duty. Upham remains the only combat soldier to be awarded a bar to his Victoria Cross. 2 other men have received a bar, both from the Royal Army Medical Corps, Noel Chavas and Arthur Martin Leake. At the conclusion of the war, Upham returned to Canterbury. He shunned the spotlight and turned down a knighthood. He founded a farm despite the ongoing difficulties with his injuries. There he maintained his modest life with his wife Molly and 3 daughters, although legend has it he never allowed a piece of German machinery onto his property until his death in 1994. Well, thank you once again, Murray, for that script, and thanks for kicking us off with a great one for season 33. Once again, if you would like to become a patron of the podcast, we would really appreciate that. It's patreon.com/The History Network to become a patron there. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.